There is a specific kind of person that the world has never quite known what to do with. Not the shy person, not the sad person, not the person who wants connection but cannot find it, but the person who has access to connection, who is capable of it, who is liked by the people around them, and who still, at the end of a social day, feels something that can only be described as relief when the door closes and the silence begins. A relief so complete and so physical that it functions less like the absence of something stressful and more like the presence of something deeply necessary. And this person has spent a significant portion of their life wondering whether that relief means something is wrong with them, whether the preference for their own company over most other company is a symptom of something that needs fixing, whether the person they are when they are alone, more themselves, more alive, more genuinely present than in almost any social situation, is the real version or a retreat from reality. And today, we are going to answer that question with the full weight of psychological research behind the answer. Because the science of solitude preference is one of the most misunderstood and most important bodies of knowledge in all of personality psychology, and what it reveals about the people who prefer being alone will permanently change how you understand both them and yourself. The first thing the psychology of solitude preference establishes, and this is foundational to everything else, is that preferring to be alone is not the same thing as being lonely. And conflating the two is one of the most consequential and most common errors in both popular and clinical psychology. Loneliness is the painful discrepancy between the social connection you have and the social connection you want. It is an unmet need, a deficit experience, a form of suffering. Solitude preference is the genuine, stable, dispositionally grounded orientation toward time alone as a source of restoration, creativity, and self-knowledge rather than deprivation. It is not a deficit of desire for connection, but a different architecture of that desire, one that requires more depth and less frequency, more quality and less volume, more genuine intimacy and less social performance. Susan Cain's landmark research on introversion, which draws on decades of personality psychology and neurological research, establishes that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the population has a nervous system that is more sensitive to external stimulation than the other half, that is wired to reach optimal arousal at lower levels of social and environmental input, and that genuinely and non-pathologically recharges through solitude rather than social interaction. And these are not damaged people. They are not socially failed extroverts. They are people whose neurology is organized differently, whose dopamine sensitivity and reticular activating system function differently, and whose need for alone time is as genuinely biological and as legitimately human as the extrovert's need for social stimulation. Now, let's go into what actually happens psychologically during solitude for the person who prefers it, because this is where the research becomes genuinely illuminating rather than merely validating, and where the specific value of solitude preference to cognitive, creative, and emotional functioning becomes most visible. Research by psychologist Esther Buchholz, whose work on the need for alone time represents one of the most serious academic treatments of solitude as a positive developmental need rather than a social failure, demonstrates that solitude serves specific and irreplaceable psychological functions. It is the cognitive environment in which self-knowledge deepens, in which the internal narrative of identity is authored rather than performed, in which creative synthesis occurs through the kind of diffuse, associative, unconstrained thinking that social environments with their demands for responsiveness and social management make neurologically impossible. Neuroscience confirms this through research on the default mode network, the brain system that activates during inward-directed thinking imagination, and self reflection, and whose activity is suppressed during social interaction and external task engagement, showing that the periods of solitude that the alone preferring person seeks are the periods during which some of the brain's most important processing occurs, the periods in which experiences are integrated, in which creative problems are solved through the non-linear thinking that social stimulation interrupts, and in which the self is not presented to others but genuinely inhabited by its owner. There is also a specific relationship between solitude preference and emotional depth that the research reveals, and that most people who prefer being alone will immediately recognize, which is that the person who spends significant time alone develops, through that practice of sustained self-company, a more differentiated, more precise, and more genuinely intimate relationship with their own inner world than the person who continuously externalizes their processing through social interaction. And this inner richness is not just personally satisfying. It is the source of the unusual perceptiveness, the emotional intelligence, and the creative and intellectual depth that people who prefer solitude so frequently demonstrate in the moments when they do choose to engage. Because the person who knows their own mind with precision can engage with other minds with a quality of presence and authenticity that the person who has never developed that inner relationship simply cannot replicate. And here is the final truth, the one that people who prefer being alone most need to hear and most rarely do. Your preference for solitude is not a social failure, not a developmental deficit, not an obstacle to the full human life that relationships are supposed to provide, and not a problem that the right person or the right social environment will eventually cure. It is a feature of your psychological architecture that, properly understood and properly honored, is the source of some of your greatest strengths, the condition under which you think most clearly, feel most fully, create most freely, and are most genuinely and completely yourself. And the world does not need you to be more social. It needs you to be more fully what you already are when the door closes. The silence begins, and you finally, completely come home to yourself. Subscribe for more Mind Secrets.